And joining us now to discuss the latest in Iran is Daniel Flesch, Senior Policy Analyst on the Middle East and North Africa with the Heritage Foundation. Good to have you with us this morning, Daniel. Stark warnings for the regime in Iran from the U.S., but also in the latest, Trump is saying that Iran is actually seeking talks with the U.S. What do you anticipate there?
Yes, well, good to be here. The Iranian regime certainly finds itself between a rock and a hard place with the protests gaining in strength, momentum, and scope of the last week or so. And the Ayatollah knows that President Trump makes good on his threats to take military or other action against the regime, as we saw during Operation Midnight Hammer last June. So it's of course obvious that the regime, the leaders, will at least feign to want to talk to the president to buy some time, relieve some pressure, forestall a U.S. action, whether that's military or other action against them. It doesn't surprise me. The question really is, what does President Trump want to do? And does he want to, as he said last week or the other week, saying, if there is violence against these protesters, the U.S. will do something. We're at this point now, so it remains to be seen what he chooses to do.
Yes, he does also say that the U.S. is watching closely by the hour. I mean, how soon are you anticipating we could see potentially seismic change in Iran?
Well, the president's supposed to meet with his advisors tomorrow, Tuesday, to deliberate and discuss further and consider a range of options. But there's a lot of stuff they could be doing more immediately before moving military assets to the region, such as starting to seize or at least monitor and track Iranian or other flagged shipments of oil to and from the country, particularly goes from Iran to China. If there could be a military buildup, we would see that taking place. But again, we know the military buildup of last summer took place over a few weeks, so it would take some time. However, immediately the president could ratchet up the diplomatic pressure on Iran. Also, a call could go out to everyone in the United States, political leaders in particular, and Europe, to increase the pressure on the regime itself as well. So steps we could be doing even now that is in advance of any sort of military action.
Okay, and if the regime does fall, what comes next?
Well, that's still an open question. That's a very open question with most revolutions and protests and demonstrations. Most revolutions require at least two things for a new government to come into power. One is a ideological leader, and another is an operational leader. That could also often be the same person. In this case, it may not be. Reza Pahlavi, the son of the former Shah, is an ideological leader. It's actually his call for Iranians to come out in the streets at 8 p.m. local time last Friday that prompted this new resurgence of protests. Of course, he's been out of the country for about 40 or 50 years, living in the United States or elsewhere. And so he has not been back in Iran, although many people refer to him as perhaps the presumptive heir, presumptive leader to take over the country. It remains to be seen as well if the Ayatollah himself is removed from power. That does not mean the regime itself is gone. You still have the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, essentially the paramilitary that is supposed to back the regime has considerable power, not to mention the guns in the country. So this thing is far from over. But the hope I would suspect is the Iranian people are able to liberate themselves with perhaps Reza Pahlavi as a titular leader to begin with, but certainly transition to something more stable and democratic in the future.
And just considering where we're at right now in this point of the unrest, what factors from here on out are most likely to precipitate the downfall of the regime there?
Well, the first thing I'd say certainly right now is if the U.S. decides to take action. And again, it could take a number of different forms, but if there's a lot of pressure points the regime has. For example, if we start interdicting and seizing Iranian shipments of oil to Russia and China in particular, suddenly the regime has no sort of economic or financial leverage, or it can't even pay the bills effectively. And that is what began this protest, is the falling currency, the plummeting of the Iranian rial. And so that's what prompted this financial straits that they're in. In addition, these protests, if they are sustained, if they get support right now, perhaps from outside actors, particularly because the regime has cut internet power to the countries, only operating at about 1% of bandwidth, as I understand it. So if the Iranian people can get more messages out and receive messages from the outside world, that can help sustain them as well and show the regime that there's more support for the protesters than the regime. And beyond that, I'd say if these protests sustain themselves, could reach a tipping point when the regime elites start to either flee or turn on the regime itself. And that is when you could see things really tipping to a post-regime environment.
And I know you've served as a senior advisor at Israel's mission to the United Nations. What role, if any, might Israel and or the UN play in the aftermath of these protests, or indeed from this point on?
Yeah, from the Israeli point of view, the Prime Minister Netanyahu and the government's been pretty vocal and obviously supporting the Iranian people, but this is not a fight they can really engage in beyond obviously hoping and praying for an end to the regime and the liberation of the Iranian people. The UN itself has a very limited role and leverage to play here. Again, particularly now in the Trump era, it's really a question of what the president himself wants to do and how much other leaders can do to support the Iranian people. I saw just today that the European Parliament is no longer going to allow Iranian diplomats to enter their committee rooms and their buildings, as I understand it. That's a great signal to show that the regime is losing support in the West. So it's a lot of these smaller measures to show that the regime should be on its way out can help build support from the outside while the Iranian people continue to build pressure from the inside.
Lastly, what will you be watching for next?
Well, I'll certainly be waiting to see what the communications come out from the White House after Trump meets with his advisors tomorrow on Tuesday. Continue to see what the Iranian protesters do, if they can expand the scope of their protests. We'll still, we saw earlier in your segment that about 500 people have been confirmed to be killed by the regime. That number will certainly rise, and that number also might already be much higher. But because of the internet blackout, we don't have a clear sense and picture of it. So these kind of small things. And also, the president just noted that he was going to talk to Elon Musk about trying to get more Starlink access to Iran. If that's a possibility, again, opening up internet access can give the outside world a much better indication of what's happening on the ground. So these individual considerations in the next few days will, I think, make a big determination in the direction the protests go.
Yeah, many moving parts in a very short time span. Good to speak with you, Daniel Flesch. Thank you so much.
Thank you.